Welcome back, my friends, to another episode of the Shema podcast. I have an important topic I wanted to discuss today. I want to talk about what is quantifiably the number one threat to the Jewish people at this point in our history. And you may be thinking, hey, Dan, you just covered that with Rabbi Shore talking about anti-Semitism. But if that was your conclusion, then you may need to listen to that again, because the message from that was mostly that what anti-Semitism has done, especially through the words of Adolf Hitler himself, is brought clarity to who the Jew is and our sacred role in creation. So before we get into this, I want to bring back some ideas that I discussed in the episode on escape from the exile of Edom. And in that episode, I discussed some of the teachings of the Morah on the Parsha, the verses of the covenant of the parts with Avraham, and how he explained that through the taking those three animals and cutting them down the middle, that what Avraham was looking at is that he was seeing the exiles of his future nation. And the first three exiles could be clearly delineated down the middle, and he can make a very clear argument. The alternative position provided by these other nations that we would fight with over time. With the Babylonians, they came after us and said the purpose of life is physical strength because might makes right. And Abraham had a very clear argument to that. And he said, no, the purpose of living, the purpose of mankind is who is strong, one can overpower his Yetzer Hara, who can allow their spiritual self to shine through and overpower physicality. And then he looked at the exile of Persia, and their argument was against the emotions. The purpose of life is to go after emotions and lust. And Avraham had a very clear argument to that. It was no, the greatest pleasure, the most sustainable, permanent pleasure is in cleaving to our Creator and emulating him in this world. And then he knew the Greeks would come along and attack us at the mental level. And the Greeks said their philosophy was the purpose of life was to seek earthly wisdom, to expand our presence in the world, our sense of self, and be able to dominate others through the wisdom we obtain. And Abraham said, no, there's a clear argument against that. The purpose of life is to achieve godly wisdom, to minimize our sense of self, and to expand our consciousness. So there's three clear arguments. The problem was with the fourth exile of Edom, because Edom would move back and forth between his previous three exiles, previous three philosophies, and has nothing inherently of its own. It would constantly change terminology, using words like a shell game, changing the definition of words over and over to create confusion. Nothing gets followed through to logical conclusion. And that was the greatest threat, that the Jewish people would get trapped in this mental exile of Edom. One of the other things we have discussed to really build the framework of this conversation is we've discussed before how many rabbis who subscribe to this idea of Jewish denominations, which the whole idea of Jewish denominations begins at the same place, that is that the Torah came from men who lied and said it came from God. They all stem from that same philosophy. And most rabbis will be very forthright in that. And some you need to ask some questions before they divulge the reality of their philosophy. Hence, the Torah and all its laws don't apply to Jews today. What is amazing about the Jewish people, and this isn't a compliment, but we're going to really get down to what is causing this. But if you look at the majority of these Jewish denominations, or all these Jewish denominations that preach this idea, Jews still show up, even though the rabbis say the Torah is not factual. We did not receive the Torah at Mount Sinai. Now, I've never heard of a Christian denomination where a minister would say, in our Christian denomination, we don't believe anything in the New Testament ever occurred. We believe it's totally made up. Because Christians would logically say, then why the hell are we here? Why are we paying the mortgage on this building? Why are we paying your salary? Why am I missing Sunday football? We're going home. But the Jewish people keep showing up. It's very bizarre, but I think that's where this whole conversation is leading to. Furthermore, we have discussed that while the majority of people in the world, including Jews, will say, I believe in God, if you ask them to define God, the God they define is the God that Pharaoh believed in. And as Rabbi Natan, the disciple of Rabbi Nachman, said, if you don't believe and know that your creator is controlling everything and governing all your affairs and orchestrating every single event to help you actualize your potential in this world, then you are an atheist. And so what happens in the vacuum of an understanding that God is one, that he is controlling everything, he's aware of every individual, especially every Jew, what happens in that vacuum? In the vacuum and not knowing the Torah came from our creator and it is the roadmap, the blueprint for a Jew to actualize their potential and bring about a revelation of Hashem. Well, something gets filled into that vacuum. And this is what has happened, my friends. If you look back at U.S. history, and I'm sorry for my non-U.S. listeners, but the ideas here hold the same. But if you look at U.S. history, our country was structured as a constitutional republic. The framers not only feared monarchies and oligarchies, but what they feared most was democracies. That is what they wanted to protect us from. Because an oligarchy or monarchy, when the few try to control the many and are tyrannical over the many can overtake them. The problem with the democracy is the majority can become tyrannical over the minority. So what they did was they created a constitutional republic, limiting the powers of the federal government, enumerating them. I know you're probably asking, Dan, what in the hell does this have to do with Judaism? What does this have to do with Torah? I'm getting there. Be patient. This was the idea of our government, a government that limited the powers of the federal government, left democracies to the state in order to protect liberty. During the FDR years, this has expanded. And the way he did it was not in a very honest method, because he proposed his New Deal and the U.S. Supreme Court said, none of this is constitutional. Congress does not have the authority to do any of these things. So after 4 terms in office, being able to appoint many Supreme Court justices, and open letters I've read in books where he literally told those nominees, I will nominate you to be a Supreme Court justice if you use reverse algebra and start with, I want this law to be constitutional, find out the logical argument for it to be so. And that is what they do. When you read these cases, that's exactly what you see. And what that allowed to happen is the scope of government in this country to have much more powers than the Constitution afforded it. So the other thing I want to point out that happened in U.S. history is in the 60s, you had this sexual revolution, these young teenage hippies with minds saturated in THC and LSD. And the Satan, which I believe is my philosophy, came out with the greatest marketing campaign ever. We talk a lot about the purpose of mankind led by the Jew through the bris milah is to overcome their lusts like animals and elevate themselves. The lowest thing someone can do is succumb to the lust of the animal kingdom. What Satan did was he said, you're not making lust, you're making love. It's ingenious. Like, who's against love? And this sexual revolution has evolved until what we have now. About 5 years ago, my nephew sent me his screenshot from his application at the University of Texas. And when you clicked on the button for gender, instead of having male and female drop down, the drop down covered the entire computer screen with 50 different options. Now, this is where I'm getting to with how this has influenced the Jewish people, and I have the greatest guests to come on and discuss it. But here's what is happening, my friends. This philosophy is what is being taught in lieu of Torah in these synagogues. They have become the church of liberalism with Jewish symbols. I've seen this firsthand. I've heard the sermons. I listened when I was out at a Reformed synagogue, reserving shelf space for Rabbi Yochel Wolbe to teach Torah. I was preparing the kosher food to bring back to the classroom, and I heard the rabbi who wanted to use the place we normally had our class to discuss Pesach, Passover, with the young students. I said, fantastic, of course. We don't want to interfere with that. Here's what I heard. Was he talking about how the 10 plagues and the 10 miracles just demonstrated Hashem's control over everything in nature? No, 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 no. Did he discuss that Mitzrayim was a mental state restriction that we free ourselves from and become free through receiving the Torah? No. The entire lecture to these young Jewish minds was on the civil rights movement. It has literally become a religion. So I wanted to bring on the right person to discuss this, someone who has made this his life goal to understand this, a fellow Jew. And his name is Daniel Greenfield. And if you're not familiar with him, you should check out his website. I will put it in the show notes. But he is the executive vice president of programs at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. He has been on many, many news channels, writes many op-ed pieces. He is at the forefront of this battle. His greatest accomplishment in my book, was he was named by the Southern Poverty Law Center as being a hate group of one. Man, this is the guy I went on.
Welcome to the Shema Podcast, the podcast for the perplexed, where Torah insights, intertwined through personal stories, as well as interviews with leading Torah scholars, demonstrate the empowering qualities of Torah and mitzvot. For more great Torah learning through Torch, the Torah Outreach Center of Houston, go to torchweb.org. Now to the show.
So Daniel, welcome for joining us. I apologize for the lengthy intro, but there was a lot I wanted to cover and set the table before I brought you on.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's very much appreciated. I think that does set the stage very nicely. And I think we have to take a little bit of a step back. The condition in which Jews have been living for so long, we call it the Galut. But apart from the spiritual dimensions, what does that mean? For so many ordinary Jews, it meant that their lives were defined by exclusion. Rather, for some Jews, they certainly understood that it was important for them to create a separate identity, that being Jewish, being part of that community, the religious community, was really the defining mission of the Jewish people and had been certainly since the days of the Avot. But for so many Jews, they were seeing, particularly around the 17th, 18th centuries, they were seeing what the possibilities were, particularly in Europe. Of all the things that were happening, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and they were on the wrong side of it. And they felt like, even the Jews who were not actually living in ghettos or the Pale of Settlement felt like on the other side of the wall, there were these incredible opportunities, but they would have to convert to Christianity to get to them. And for majority of Jews back then, that was still a problem. There were some Jews who went along, who did it sincerely or insincerely, converted to Christianity and joined the larger world. But then along came the possibility of being able to become part of that world without actually having to convert, at least what did not seem like an actual conversion. And this was really the part of the genesis of the Reform movement, which has to be viewed within the context of the larger liberalism that was happening, particularly in Germany and parts of Western Europe, which said that you can be a Jew at home and a mensch on the street. You can give up your public Jewishness and start to fit in, and you can change some of the tenets of your religion, which is what Reform Judaism went on to do, discard the whole thing about Israel, the Beis Hamikdash, the idea of a separate Jewish people, and you can join society. And it seemed like a pretty good deal. Of course, it was a very poison deal, but it seemed like it was a transition that Jews could go ahead and make without having to give up way too much. And really, unfortunately, the majority of Jews did go along and take that deal. They went along with it. They went to some of the finest universities. They became wealthy and prosperous. They seemingly were able to join society. Of course, the ultimate result of that was the Holocaust, which ended the experiment in liberalism in part, and then revived it post-Holocaust on even worse terms. And Jews today, post-October 7th, as Rabbi Shor discussed, have seen now very clearly just how much worse the terms have gotten. But the larger idea for Jews was that social progress could do what Judaism could not. There's a famous book about the Jewish communist movement in America, and its title is Till the Messiah Tarried. And Jews became worshipful of the idea of social liberalism as the Redeemer. The Mashiach had not come. The Jews had not come back to Eretz Yisrael. This incredible transformation had not taken place through conventional, traditional Torah Judaism, But social liberalism seemed to have accomplished this transformation, and they adopted the idea of tikkun olam, which was obviously a distortion, but in practical terms to them meant that it was the job of the Jews also to extend social liberalism to all other seemingly oppressed groups, which is why, yes, at the Passover Seder, in teaching about Passover, they will obsessively talk about the civil rights movement. When you hear Reform rabbis talk about the civil rights movement, to them, it's like the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. This is their fundamental religious experience for them. And it is, because if you understand what their religion actually is versus what they say it is. They say that they're following some version of Judaism. They're not. They're following an ideology of social liberalism because for their ancestors, social liberalism took them out of the ghettos. It took them out of the Pale of Settlement. This was the great transformative movement.
Let me ask you a question, Daniel. So, one of the things I was sort of saying in the intro about this vacuum that got left when they don't believe their creator is controlling everything, which I understand after the Holocaust, it was so traumatic that having bitachon and your creator, they probably felt left down. That's why I was sort of saying in that vacuum where their trust goes, their bitachon is in government. And then, of course, without the idea of Torah too, that the tikkun olam is no longer about revealing Hashem in the world, but about social justice, climate change, all these other big lofty things, which their neshama knows they're here for a bigger purpose themselves. Would you say that sort of fits into the overall idea that you just explained?
Indeed. So you adopt the idea that government is really the fundamental force in the world, and government is just actualizing the social liberalism movement. It's actualizing progress. And you have ideas like the right side of history, which was coined actually by an anti-Semitic Christian cleric. The idea that the arc is always bending toward justice. All these phrases really, they're messianic phrases, but they're kind of a secular messianism. They say that if we really want to transform the world, we can do it. It's you can see elements of the Tower of Babel in that. And if we actually form this movement, if we try to transform the world, yes, we can fix the environment. We can liberate all the oppressed peoples. We can create all these new gender identities. But this is really the underlying idea of Marxism is, beyond social liberalism, is to deconstruct everything that existed in order to create some ideal world. We go back to year zero. In my book, Domestic Enemies, actually, I discuss how the French Revolution innovated a lot of these things. You were going to go back to year zero and reverse everything that had come before. And of course, religion is part of the problem. Thus, the idea that Jews would be able to maintain any kind of individual attachment to religion or Judaism or Israel had to go by the wayside. And it's one of the first things the Reform movement had to throw out, the idea of Jerusalem. They would say, Berlin is our new Jerusalem. Of course, we know how that worked out. And after October 7th, Jews, of course, rediscovering this part of the bargain, which is that you have to toss aside anything that does not integrate well in this larger liberal Protestant idea. And this was, by the way, when we talk about Reform Judaism, when you talk about some of these liberal theologies, they are really liberal Protestant. And the idea was you would have to create a Judaism that would be much like liberal Protestantism, which is what Reform Judaism is, one that would be focused on social progress, that would really ignore and avoid any tricky theological issues, certainly the idea of an actual messianic redemption, of an actual God that is really in control of the world, because that is uncomfortable. If you have a God in control of the world who wants specific things from you, not just social justice, not just, as liberal Christians sum up their theology, the goal is just to be nice to other people. And you obviously have this within liberal Judaism where, the idea is, just do nice things to other people. Mitzvahs, be nice to other people. That's not actually what a mitzvah means. A mitzvah is a commandment. That's not just be nice to other people. And when you do that, you can effectively cut God out of the equation because, you don't need to be a religious person to be a nice person. You can just be nice to other people all the time. And therefore, God is actually not fundamentally necessary. But on the other hand, there is a God who is in control of the world, who wants things, who knows more than we do. And that is really the big sticking point theologically, because if there is a God who knows more than we do, and we actually have to listen to what he says, that is fundamentally transformative. Whereas, the stuff God is saying is basically common sense. Don't kill, don't steal. We're just going to avoid doing those things, and it's fine. And we can all be people together. And we've seen how that worked out. The people who adopted that way of thinking ultimately paved the way for the Holocaust, paved the way for the people who are now cheering on Hamas. So that's absolutely not enough just to be a nice person. It's not enough just to, get a bunch of nice people together and have a government that seemingly will do nice things, because the thing is, there is bad in people. And that is something that we've had to learn the hard way. Certainly Jews have had to learn the hard way, and they're learning that all over again now.
So this is basically what was happening in Germany with the evolution of the reform movement. So you're basically saying the reform movement was the creation of this overall liberal ideology.
This is absolutely long before the Holocaust.
So are you saying Jews created this ideology or they were influenced by it?
They were influenced by it. They played a role in generating some of it. As I began saying, this is very much the liberal Protestant way of thinking, which dominated in Germany. It spread to some European countries. German Jews then spread it to the United States. The reform movement in America was very much dominated by German Jews. And it seemed like a good deal because liberal Protestants were saying to Jews, we're going to liberalize the system. We're not going to restrict Jews from being able to, say, get an education, participate in society, be citizens. In exchange, Jews will put aside some of their more divisive ideas. Christians will put aside some of their more divisive ideas. And, this should be very familiar to American Jews in a kind of, suburban utopia where everybody just kind of gets along. We don't think too much about what everybody believes, but it becomes a problem as we've seen. So the reform movement tried to adapt to this way of thinking. It was not something that Jews initially created, but Jews certainly were very quick to jump on board with it because the benefits were incredibly obvious. You could actually go to medical school, you could go to law school. And for a while, Jews formed a majority in some medical schools and law schools in Berlin before the Holocaust. So this certainly predates the Holocaust, and it was really about the larger issue, not of the Holocaust, but of Jews actually being excluded from public life. Imagine a world in which none of us could actually go to college or become professionals. For some people, it might not be that much of a loss. For a lot of people, it would be. And this really was the impetus for everything that we're saying now. The idea that social progress was the epitome of everything and that our goal was to advance society. That's really the origin of Tikkun Olam. And if you understand that's what the origin is, you understand where Reform Judaism and a lot of liberal Jews went wrong.
If you look at a Venn diagram of Torah and liberalism, if you could first start and talk about where there is overlap and then where there is distinct opposition from the other.
So seemingly some of the goals of liberalism are compatible with Judaism. We believe, obviously, in charity, we believe in making the world a better place, but we don't believe in making the world a better godless place, nor do we believe that human beings are the be-all, end-all of wisdom. And this is really where the liberal idea conflicts with the Jewish idea. So the positive, and this is, by the way, true, you've done a summary of Babylon and Greece and Rome and the past civilizations. Well, some of the positive impetus of those civilizations were around values or things that Jews actually shared. There were Greeks who very much respected the Jews, and there were Romans who, in a certain period, were actually trying to keep Shabbat, were trying to do some Jewish things, and we see this in American society as well. There are points of compatibility when it comes to doing positive things. The problem becomes with the larger philosophical areas. And with Jews, there is a problem where we kind of jump on board movements and we look at the positive things in them. We don't actually look at the negative things or the more complicated philosophical and theological conflicts down the road. We're very happy when somebody is accepting of us, in part, again, because we do have a bit of an inferiority complex, which is unfortunate. Secular Jews in particular have the sense of they're not good enough for society. And we also don't look at what the larger ideas become. So Jews are motivated not just because we want to do good things because we're nice people. We are nice people and we want to do good things. We are doing these things because God actually gave us a special and a separate mission. And that is completely incompatible with liberalism. Liberalism says we're all basically the same. We're all kind of interchangeable. And certainly there's no larger entity, no larger power that's actually giving us a mission. Our missions come from ourselves. We are self-directed. And that seemed like was kind of nice for a while. Then the 60s kick in, the counterculture kicks in, and we see actually what being self-directed, what the price of being self-directed is. If you are just purely self-directed, if your only source of morality is yourself, or mass movements, which are even worse, we saw throughout the 20th century the horrors of mass movements. Liberalism eventually becomes perverted into either radicalism on the left, radicalism on the right. By the way, there were plenty of anti-Semites who came out of liberal movements. By the way, Wilhelm Marr, who coined the term anti-Semitism and was an anti-Semite, came out of liberal movement. there were plenty of anti-Semites who came out of liberal movements. So at that point, your movement starts to become corrupted. It becomes corrupted by human impulses, by the underlying issues with humanity. And those are things that liberalism denies. Liberalism will say that humanity is perfectible. As religious people, we know that humanity is not perfectible. And this is really where the fundamental split kicks in. We are not perfectible people. We are fundamentally flawed people who are following a godly mission. Whereas liberals believe, we are ascending angels. The hereditary practice said I'd rather be ascending ape than a fallen angel. We can actually perfect ourselves up from the slime of evolution, from apehood, and we can become perfect. And we know, as Jews, as religious people in general, we know people are not becoming perfect. They are going up and down. They cling to God in order to redeem themselves, to become better. And it's still an up and down process, no matter how much you believe. And that is where everything comes apart. Liberalism does not believe it's an up and down process. And as a result, it has no ability to counter its own problems when things start going downhill.
In the US, if you were to go through and sort of recap the last, 4 or 5 presidents and rank them and summarize their support for Israel. And I'm curious to get your analysis on that, because I know you've done a lot more deep dive than I have. I'd like you to discuss that, because what I find mind-boggling is that what I know about how each president has treated Israel, that it seems like the majority of these Jews that are duped into going to the Church of Liberalism with the Jewish symbols are supporting the presidents that were the worst enemies to Israel. But I would like you, since you're more educated in this manner, to discuss that.
Well, just to briefly recap, we have this idea that there is a long, enduring relationship between Israel and America. To some degree, philosophically, religiously, for some it's true. As far as our politicians go, it's really not. There was really no good relationship between Israel and America until the JFK administration, the Truman administration, and Jews have this myth about Truman, who, and afterward he promoted the myth himself. I created Israel. I'm the new Cyrus. No, the reality is the Truman administration was anti-Israel. It was slightly less anti-Israel and anti-Semitic than the FDR administration. FDR went along and spoke to the Saudi king Ibn Saud and said that if I had my way, I'd give him the 6 million Jews of America, never mind those of Israel. FDR was militantly anti-Semitic to the point of being almost genocidal. Truman was somewhat better, but still basically anti-Semitic. There's a scene where he's actually talking to his biographer after he leaves office. It's cold, it's Missouri, it's the winter, and he tells the biographer, I'd like to invite you into my home, but my mother-in-law has never allowed a Jew in the house, and she's not going to change that. So, it's a little bit of context with people of telling the Truman and Eddie Jacobson story about his supposed friend, Eddie Jacobson, how Eddie Jacobson persuaded him to actually support Israel. The factual reality is that Truman imposed an arms embargo on Israel as it declared independence. He and the State Department people expected Israel to be destroyed by the invading Arab armies, but he also wanted to win an election, and New York was crucial to that. That's the short version of it. After that, things did not get any better with Eisenhower. Eisenhower's foreign policy was run by oil companies. His administration is probably one of the more anti-Israel ones to date. We just don't tend to remember it. And included threatening Jewish leaders, getting Jewish leaders together and threatening them that donations to Israel would be entirely cut off. Then things in the Middle East fundamentally shift, which we can appreciate. We're watching what's happening with Syria now, for example. And all the old British imperial infrastructure in the Middle East that the United States was hoping to run began collapsing. The Soviet Union built relationships with Egypt, with Syria, and suddenly Israel became one of the few options available. And then the JFK administration starts building up a relationship with Israel. LBJ continues that relationship. This is a kind of a high water mark at that point for the relationship, but it's not motivated so much by emotion. Yes, JFK gives some very nice speeches, but it's basically a self-interest relationship because America has run out of options in the Middle East. Nixon administration comes in. The results are very much a mixed bag because it is a self-interest relationship. The Nixon administration is, like the previous administrations, wants to both use Israel and also limit Israel's expansion. They want to use Israel as a kind of a carrot and stick to get the Arabs back into the American camp, not the Soviet camp, which has very horrifying consequences, particularly during the Yom Kippur War, which the Nixon administration, particularly Kissinger, is well aware is coming. And they try to weaken Israel, while at the same time stepping in at the right time to seemingly save it and then weaken it again. This becomes kind of the template. The Reagan administration is another high watermark in some ways because it does mark a Republican Party that is becoming pro-Israel. At the same time, it's also a mixed bag because some of the old guard are still there. Before that, though, the Carter administration marks probably the lowest point after Eisenhower in the relationship with Israel because this is an administration that isn't motivated by transforming the Middle East, transforming America's relationship with the Middle East by empowering various enemies, taking down the Shah in Iran, and believing that if America forms an alliance with various Islamic groups, that is actually going to be the way forward in the Middle East. This is the genesis of the generations of Islamic terrorism we've been dealing with since is the Carter administration. And the Reagan administration has some complicity in that as well, unfortunately. So does the first Bush administration. Anyway, the upside is a lot of these administrations, the relationship with Israel has not been, shall we say, particularly good. The second Bush administration is probably the most pro-Israel administration until the first Trump administration comes in. But at the same time, there are still very much limitations. And the Obama administration, that's another low watermark, one that actually takes the Democratic Party more permanently into the anti-Israel camp. And that's something we can actually see when we look at poll numbers. When you check polls of who Democrats sympathize with most, Israel or the terrorists, under Obama, for the first time, Democrats start swinging to the terrorist side. By now, the Biden administration, it's very decisively about half and half, particularly when you look at younger Democrats, the 18 to 34 crowd, increasingly you do see larger sympathies, or at least equal sympathies with the terrorists. And this is not just a function of what the media reports, though that's certainly part of it. It's also a function of the increasing radicalization of the Democratic Party. It's moved toward the left to a reflexive sympathy with terrorists over civilized nations. And it's part of a larger trend that's possibly beyond our current discussion. Certainly, the first Trump administration was a major high watermark. It's been the most pro-Israel administration that existed. It's one that actually allowed Israel to do things like recognize Israel's capital, recognize the Golan Heights, a major issue now, considering what just happened in Syria. Last week, the UN actually voted to demand once again that Israel withdraw from the Golan Heights. Instead, Israel is not only withdrawn, it's now actually expanding and fortifying a presence on Har Hermon, on Mount Hermon. This is important if you look back at just how bloody the battles were for the Golan Heights in the Yom Kippur War and the Six-Day War. Those were some of the most challenging battles and some of the most challenging terrain. And the Trump administration did that pretty freely. It was not expecting anything in exchange. In the past, Israeli governments would actually try to negotiate deals with the White House. And, we'll give you this, we'll give you this. Sharon, for example, agreed to withdraw from Gaza. It was a disastrous move. But he did it in exchange for American assurances about Gaza, about being able to annex parts of Yehuda and Shomron. Those understandings were completely worthless and not kept. And that's been a pattern. Now, the Israelis try to arrange some sort of deal. They get promises. Those promises are never kept. The Trump administration, on the other hand, went ahead with moving the embassy to Yerushalayim and with recognizing the Golan Heights and making some other moves that were not reciprocal. They were not in exchange for anything. And I would have to say this is the first time in the American-Israeli relationship that has even happened.
Beautiful. Wow. I knew I had the right guy on for this episode. So here's my follow-up question to that analysis. And again, I just want to repeat for the listeners. I don't care how any Jew votes. Don't care. What I care about is Jews becoming open to the divinity of their Torah and learning from it and understanding what their mission is. What I find remarkable about all this is that you had, like you said, the low mark with Obama and a high mark with Trump. I cannot see anywhere in this 70-80% of the Jewish population that subscribes to liberalism to denounce Obama for the things he did against Israel or to compliment Trump on the positive things he did for Israel. Like, why?
The times they are changing. We actually have seen Jews increasingly move over to the Republican side, to the Trump side. We've seen people who are Jewish liberals actually praise Trump for his recent statement about the terrorists and Hamas. So there is a bit of a changing wind. It's partly generational, but it's really there's basically a fundamental divide here. There's a divide between Jews who actually look at Jewish interests and say, okay, here is what this party has done for us. This is what this president has done for us. And we should be, we should be grateful for that. And there are those who are still committed to this economic idea, to the idea of social liberalism above all else. And they will still focus on, well, what are Trump's policies on transgender issues? What are his policies on abortion? We are very angry about this. And forget about which party you're voting for or not. If your metric is not Jewish interests, if your metric is not Jewish issues, then frankly, you're not voting as Jews. You're not thinking as Jews. You're thinking as liberals, which is fine if you don't actually want to be Jews. If Jews, being Jewish is fourth or fifth or sixth, somewhere down there on the list of priorities, that is what you do. And that is what a whole lot of American Jews are doing. And that is a major problem, because when you have something like October 7th and you're wondering, why is nobody standing with us? It's because this idea of collective solidarity that they've been sold on, that if we stand for all these oppressed groups, we are there for Black Lives Matter, we are there for trans lives, we are there for Asian hate, Stop Asian Hate. If we are there for all these things, they're going to be there for us. And they're discovering these people are not only not there for them, in many cases, they're actually there for the other side. And some Jews have woken up. They've learned the lesson. We can easily see that in a lot of places. Others have not. Others still continue to believe in this fictional myth that if Jews give up their own interests and support others, they're being somehow very noble, or that somehow this will all work out, what they call collective solidarity. In fact, collective solidarity has hopelessly failed. So either Jews vote their own interests or they vote somebody else's interests. I mean, if you vote somebody else's interests, if your focus is on this kind of liberal altruism and it doesn't pay off, and you do it again and it doesn't pay off, and you do it again and it doesn't pay off, and liberal Jews have been doing this since the 70s. Since the 70s, they've been voting everybody else's causes. They've been devoted to the civil rights movement. And frankly, if you look at ADL polling, minority groups have higher rates of anti-Semitism than white people do. And this has been consistently that way for a while. So if you are okay with supporting groups that are more likely to be anti-Semitic over supporting Jews, then you should not be surprised if the result is greater anti-Semitism.
What do you think is the solution? Meaning, as I mentioned, every Kiruv, Jewish outreach rabbi I ever spoke to, who told me this is a systemic issue where they get very, like the success rate at their job at bringing Jews back to Torah, Judaism, with this group, when they identify as a liberal, it's like not measurable, the success rate. And I was speaking with someone, a dear friend of mine, who said, hey, Dan, only 20% of the Jews left Egypt. We are on a fast track towards the era of Mashiach, being back in Israel with the temple, with the Torah as our constitution, as a Hedron court, learning Torah all day. If they don't want to come again, oh well. And that is prophesized in the Zohar that will happen again. However, negative prophecies, as we know, are there's warnings. The positive prophecies are promises. My argument against taking that approach is I think what happened during the Holocaust was our Creator yelling at us very loud and clear. And it wasn't just the Jews who were throwing off the yoke of Torah that got pulled into the Holocaust. It was a lot of very pious Jews. And it's Hashem telling us, you're all in this together. Do not give up on each other. And besides the things that are sort of waking Jews up by these groups that they wanted to support, thinking they would be reciprocated, and that's clearly not happening now, can we do, again, not to get Jews to vote a certain way, but to get Jews to realize that liberalism has become a religion for them, and Torah Judaism is the religion that is meant for them, that is designed for them by their Creator, and the way for them to achieve really everything they're wanting to accomplish in the world. What's the solution here?
Well, one way is to look at results. In the 50s, maybe in the 60s, this would have been a more challenging case, but you can actually look around at the results of Jews following liberalism and Jews following Torah values. And you can look at practical results. There's every, Aish show probably has that chart about, are your grandchildren going to be Jewish? And you follow the more liberal way, your grandchildren are not going to be Jewish, and you may not even have grandchildren. If you follow the Torah way, well, you are likely to have a whole lot of Jewish grandchildren. That's one metric. Another metric is, are the Jews actually safer? Are they better off in liberal areas, or are they better off with actual community solidarity? Are they better off being part of integrated Jewish communities? When something like October 7th happens, so many Jews who have been part of this liberal infrastructure are talking about how they felt abandoned by their colleagues and their friends and their book clubs and all that. Would they have felt abandoned if they were actually part of religious Jewish communities? We all know the answer to that. You can look at the results in the larger society. You can look at it globally. And we can discuss philosophy, we can discuss theology, but the bottom line is you look at the results, you look at, is life better for you or is it worse? Is the path you've chosen, how has it worked out? People have done this for 40, 50 years, looking back at the world that they've been part of. Has it actually made them happy? Are they better, more fulfilled people for being part of a more liberal secular society as opposed to their counterparts in the religious community?
It always comes down to education. I like those ideas because they get at something fundamental in a Jew that they will not let go of. Meaning, I always approached everything in my years as an atheist that the Torah is not true. I believed everything my rabbi said, the Torah is not true. So therefore, there is no Jewish people. But most Jews won't go there. Their neshama will not let them get to the point of saying, okay, if the Torah is made up, and there was no Mount Sinai revelation, and the Jewish nation was not formed at that pivotal moment in time, then quit identifying as a Jew, but they won't do that. There's something in them very deep that won't allow them to do that. And then when you bring up the success rate at Jewish perpetuity under this system of reform or conservative, which is, again, it's just houses of liberalism, I think that's definitely very profound way. I think that will speak to a lot of people in preserving their Jewish identities. They know deep down that it's something that's important to them. We have a really difficult task, Daniel, and this is what scares me, is that Hashem wants us to be a light in the nations. He wants us to go out and influence the world, and he wants us, but he doesn't want us to assimilate. He wants us to integrate, influence without assimilating. Very difficult task. And over history, whenever we began to assimilate, then what ends up happening is Hashem does things, causes other nations to revolt against us. So we'll have to go back and regroup amongst ourselves. And that's what's kept us together over time. But I don't want to go that route again. What would you say if you were speaking to a Jew who was not exposed to the Torah wisdom, who was identifying with this other religion of liberalism? What would you say to them to convince them or get them to be open-minded to the harmful effects of this pure assimilation that we've seemed to make the same mistake over and over again throughout history?
Well, October 7th, or rather the reaction to it in America and more in Europe and more liberal communities, has been a wake-up call for a lot of Jews. It has been a wake-up call for people who nothing else has woken them up as of yet. I would certainly hope that there are not worse wake-up calls coming, but I'm afraid that there very well might be. But when people are actually confronted with something like this, with a shock to the system, they are reachable in that moment. And I'm not sure that Kyiv organizations have properly utilized that. So many people are kind of oriented around despite, or they're oriented around social change. Some others are in the throes of despair. But it is important to show them that there are positive messages from that beyond the conflicts of the moment, that it's an opportunity to reorient our lives, to build lives that are more Jewish. Now, after the Holocaust, there were people who were trying to rebuild their lives, and people who were trying to just move on, forget everything that happened. And there were others who said that the best revenge against Hitler was to actually go ahead and build Jewish lives and to actually have more Jewish children, to build more Jewish families. I know people who, even from an older generation now, who would go to Eastern Europe and they would visit some of the cemeteries. They would visit Auschwitz, and they would come away with, well, what do we do in response to this? Well, we actually build Jewish identities and we build Jewish families. And if you don't do that, then ultimately the people who are trying to destroy us have won. And that, I think, is something to take away.
I do think that there has been a lot of very positive things that came from the atrocities on October 7th. That is definitely one of them. Very well said. Now, I do want to announce something to the audience. Something I tried a little different on this podcast. I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but I had a great idea given to me by my dear friend, Ron Cardos, host of the amazing Elevator Pitches for God podcast. And he talked about bringing on and allowing members of the Shema podcast for the Perplexed WhatsApp community to come on to the recording of our podcast and be able to participate and ask questions to our host. So I'm experimenting with this idea today. I have very amazing dear friends of mine on. So I'm going to start with Ron because I know he has some questions he's posted, but I'd like to hear you go ahead and just ask the question directly to Daniel. Ron, thanks for being here.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks for coming on. This is great. Been reading your stuff on Front Page Mag for years at the Horowitz Freedom Center. Question number one. So how did the Jews attach themselves to the party, the Democratic Party, the party of slavery, pro-Jim Crow laws, party of segregation? To this day, they want segregated graduations, black graduation. They want separate dorms for the blacks. They think the blacks are stupid and we need to lower our standards in all our medical school acceptance and pilot school, and they can't even get a driver's license. We shouldn't require it. How did they take the racist party and associate themselves? And you just said FDR was not pro-Israel. In fact, he was almost genocidal against the Jews, which is a very strong statement. How did they go in that side? Now, look, I know I'm old enough to remember the Republicans were no lover of the Jews too. They were the country club that was anti-Semitic. I get that. So it was probably bad and worse. But can you respond to that?
Sure. Well, first of all, good to hear from you. Always glad to meet a long-time reader. Now, as far as why the Jews attached themselves to the Democrats, well, if you go to the late 19th century, whatever the polls were worth back then, the Jewish vote seemed to be split. Then you actually arrive at the Woodrow Wilson era, at the era where, and then at the FDR. And by the way, FDR was not just anti-Israel, it was actually militantly anti-Semitic. Some of the key Supreme Court cases that tested the New Deal were actually outright anti-Semitic. The Schechter chicken case, for example, which targeted kosher shechita, was a key element in limiting the power of the NRA, not the National Rifle Association, the National Recovery Administration, which was the New Deal's big socialist agency. So as far as what actually made the Jews, well, part of it was that you had this mass migration of Jews from Eastern Europe coming into America in the really, really late and early 20th century. And those Jews, unlike previous groups, which actually had kept their identity together, somewhat the early Sephardi communities, the German communities, they had trouble maintaining identities, especially you had people coming from shtetls, you had men coming without families, and it was a great struggle to maintain Jewish life in America. They also went into a public school system, a centralized public educational system that was the whole of the melting pot idea. So the idea was the system would take all these people coming from different places, it would strip away their various identities and beliefs and turn them into a very generic, ideal liberal citizens. And they went through this process. They were taught to despise their parents as greenies who didn't know anything. And that generation really became the big liberal Jewish generation. Since social liberalism was really the ideology there, Wilson, which was somewhat more friendlier to Jews, despite his background as a support of the KKK and all sorts of racist movements. By the time you get to FDR and the New Deal, despite the fact that FDR is anti-Semitic, he becomes a cult object of worship for American Jews. They're hanging his portraits in their homes. FDR is the definitive great leader. And while he does play a role, obviously a pretty significant role in defeating Nazi Germany, this cult movement starts even before that. And it's hard to understand this where we sit right now. You have to actually look at some of the media, the newspapers, the narratives coming out of America of the day. There is a mass propaganda movement to make FDR seem like the savior from the Great Depression and make socialism seem like the answer. And quite a few Jews who had become detached from Torah, from their identities, were caught up with this. They worshipped FDR as the great leader, and no amount of anti-Semitism, not even the Holocaust itself, did anything to change that.
Well, that raises my second question. I think you just answered it, which was, can you move any Jews? Because I'm up in Northern California. We have 450,000. We're fighting a losing war here. We really are. In fact, I think we're getting ready to buy a second house in the Jewish community, maybe Las Vegas, something close to my children or in California. But it's like there's no moving these people. They're so, I know we're stiff-necked people, but is there anything that you've done or you found that works? Because I've tried everything and nothing's working. Shabbos, of course, is the best. And I think it's good, but still a lot of people aren't moving.
Well, I can understand that. Thank you for fighting the good fight. I would say what I've said before, which is you break it down to, are you putting Jewish interests and Jewish issues first? Are you putting other issues first? And that is a very clear dividing line. And there are going to be a whole lot of people who do not really see themselves as Jewish in any meaningful way, or see being Jewish as all about economy. You do polls in America, and by the way, this is where America is different, unfortunately, than Jews in the rest of the world. And they rank social justice and a sense of humor and a few other things as being more, fundamentally Jewish than endemic to Jewish identity than actual religious practice in Israel. And if you have people who are going to say that sense of humor is more important than the state of Israel or than, religious Jewish ideas, then those people are going to be really hard to recover. In some ways, it's a generational issue. I only have so much time to talk about this. The bottom line, though, is there are people who are going to be reached by systemic shocks. There are people who are not going to be reached, who are going to continue pushing liberalism above all else.
Thank you, Daniel. Great. Thank you so much, the Shema podcast guest, for coming on live. Thank you so much, Daniel. I do want to say I'm looking at a book you published earlier this year. I have not read it, but I'm definitely going to order it, called Domestic Enemies, the Founding Fathers' Fight Against the Left. This goes way beyond, I'm reading the description. This goes way beyond the FDR years. I had no idea this goes all the way back to the founding with George Washington. So I'm definitely gonna get the book. I'll put the link in the show notes. I also have the question, Daniel, that when you won the prestigious award from the Southern Poverty Law Center to be a hate group of one, do they send you any type of plaque that you can hang on your office?
Sadly not. In all fairness, not only was I named, but the crack team at the Southern Poverty Law Center back in the day also named a bar sign along with me. They didn't name the bar, they named the sign outside the bar. So it was not a very discerning group of judges over there.
Because I think you should wear it like a badge of honor. And I know my listeners in the Shema podcast WhatsApp community would be delighted to build a beautiful plaque and send it to you that you can hang on your wall with great pride, because I don't know where they get the moral authority to label you a hate group of one, but I think it's hilarious. And I think that when you have evil calling you evil, it sort of means you're on the right side of things. So thank you for taking a lot of abuse. So if we got you a beautiful plaque to hang on your office wall, would you be willing to hang it up there?
With great pride. I always wanted a plaque or a medal or something I could just wear around town.
I'm going to get my podcast group on that, and we'll work to put that together for you. I also put the links to where you blog, and I appreciate Ron Cardos for getting us in contact. Absolute delight to have you here, and hopefully we can have you on again to share your wisdom on this matter.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. Thank you so much for the great questions and the great discussion, and thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Daniel.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting Torch so they can continue to spread Torah wisdom to the world by making a donation at torchweb.org and clicking donate in the top right corner of the page.